Never meet your heroes. Maybe you've heard that famous phrase, the idea that you should never meet the people that you idolize. The odds are they're going to fail to fulfill our expectations, and our image of them will come crashing down. This can happen when we idolize a spiritual leader who later suffers a deep moral failing, or when we discover one of our favorite historical figures turns out to be a slave owner or an unfaithful spouse. It makes it easy to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If someone I admired so much did something so bad, well, how could I ever want to emulate or honor or follow them? Well, today I'm going to spend some time sharing with you about King David of Israel through the book of 2 Samuel. Now, you'll see some of the qualities of David that are worth admiring and emulating. His humility, his strength, his kindness, his spirituality. But we'll also learn that the story of King David includes murder, adultery, abuse of power, poor leadership decisions, and much more. And it's often with David on the wrong side of the coin. David can feel like a hero that we wish we hadn't met. But as you can see from all the graphics that are surrounding me, this isn't an isolated case in the Bible of a really good leader who also really messed up. In fact, that seems like the norm in the Bible. Here at Life Academy, we've been going through a series for over a year called Heroes with Feet of Clay. The reality is that every famous hero of the Bible was often as broken as they were blessed. And so are we. See, God is capable of accomplishing incredible and great things through His people, and at the same time, we are capable of committing deep sin and wandering from Him. The story of David is not just a hero story about David, how we should be just like David. In reality, it's a story about the real hero of the Old Testament who didn't have any feet of clay, the God of the Bible, and how He works His promises and His miracles through broken heroes with feet of clay, like King David, like you, and like me. Today we're picking up in the middle of the story of David. We're right at the beginning of the book of 2 Samuel. Now, if you want to hear the story as you're finding yourself wanting to know more about David, there's another pastor here at Life Academy, Pastor Brad, who's also done an episode on David, and it talks about David's life before he was king. So you can click on the link that's provided for that episode, and while you're at it, we want to invite you to like and share and subscribe to this channel as we're producing Bible-based content every single week. And as you connect with the channel, that's going to help us to share the good news of God and to enrich people's faith. Now, to understand the story of David's kingship, there's a key verse from the book of 1 Samuel that's important for us to know. Now, today we're primarily focusing on 2 Samuel, but in the original Hebrew Bible, there was no 1 and 2 Samuel. There was just one book called Samuel. Later editors of the scripture decided to break the story up in the middle in order to make it more digestible for modern readers. But the two books of Samuel are really one story by one author. At the beginning of 1 Samuel, we learn of a woman named Hannah who gives birth to a future prophet. She names him Samuel. In her prayer of thanksgiving to God after Samuel is born, she utters an important line. "The Lord makes poor, and the Lord makes rich. He brings low, and He exalts." God is the one who brings low. God is the one who lifts up. Now, this verse serves as sort of a theme verse for both 1 and 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel follows that theme for King Saul of Israel. God lifts him up, and then after he fails as king, God lowers him, rejecting him. And ultimately, 1 Samuel ends in Saul's death in battle. But Saul's not the only rise and fall story in the Samuel saga. That rise and fall verse, or that God brings up and God lowers verse at the beginning of 1 Samuel, turns out to be a key for the story of David too. Because David is also a rise and fall narrative. But there's something key at the end of David's story, something that sets him apart from Saul. There's a contrast between David and Saul the writer wants us to see. The first 6 chapters of 2 Samuel tell us about David's rise to power. They're summarized by a key verse in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. God lifts up, God lowers. Now, when we open up to 2 Samuel, we discover there's a sort of anarchy. Saul has just been killed in war against the Philistines, and David had been anointed king many years before by Samuel, but the people are divided. See, governments in the ancient world did not function with elections and peaceful transfers of power. The throne was usually claimed in one of 2 ways. You inherited it, or you usurped it. Either you became the king because you were the king's son, or you kill the king's family and take the throne by force. So many of the tribes of Israel are siding with Saul's son Ishbosheth as the rightful king, while the tribe of Judah sides with David. We're set up to expect a long, brutal war where David murders all of Saul's descendants and usurps the throne. But instead, David models a different way. David refuses to follow the common way of his time and kill to be king. In fact, when a foreigner, an Amalekite, falsely claims to have been the one who killed Saul, hoping that King David will give him a reward, David has the Amalekite put to death for destroying the Lord's anointed. Shortly afterwards, Ishbosheth himself, Saul's son, is murdered in chapter 4. Once again, the killers come to David, expecting a great reward for helping him become king, and once again, David denounces the crime, and he has the murderers put to death. See, David believed in some words that had been uttered by a man named Abner. This was Saul's general in 2 Samuel chapter 3. The Lord has sworn to David to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to set up the throne of David over Israel and Judah. Now, David was confident that God's promises would be fulfilled to him in God's timing. He didn't have to take matters into his own hands, acting immorally to get his own power. Once again, David shows us what it means to be a man after God's own heart, to live God's way and trust in his timing instead of doing things his own way. Now, with God having providentially removed all of David's enemies, David finally ascends to the throne over Israel at the age of 37. This might have been decades after Samuel had anointed him as king, but David would reign for the next 33 years. Though it had took the promises of God decades to be fulfilled, they had been fulfilled to David. Now, this great moment is punctuated by 2 other important events. First, David and his men conquer the city of Jerusalem, where David sets up his kingdom, and the Ark of God's covenant is brought into Jerusalem. The Ark symbolizes that God's physical presence and his glory is with David. His blessing is with his people. His presence is with the king. That's what sets us into David's peak. David's now risen to power. He's ruling in Jerusalem as has been long prophesied. And the next 4 chapters, chapters 7 to 10, tell us of the peak of his power. Now, these chapters can also be summarized by a key verse that we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 11. God declares to David, "The Lord will make you a house." Now, 2 Samuel 7 is perhaps one of the most important chapters in the entire Old Testament. See, the Old Testament is a series of God's covenants. They're major promises that God makes to his people, which would ultimately find their fulfillment in Jesus. Now, one of the most major covenants in the Old Testament was with an ancestor of David named Abraham. Back in Genesis 12, God had made 3 promises to Abraham. He would bring him to a promised land, he would make him into a great nation, and all the other nations would be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. Now, in 2 Samuel, 1,000 years after the covenant's been made, we're seeing the covenant fulfilled. God has brought Israel to the promised land. He has made them into a great nation. And with King David at their head, they begin to bless the other Gentile nations around them as they become believers in God. But the noteworthy part in 2 Samuel 7 is that God makes another covenant. This time, he's making a covenant with David. David's on the throne, he's moved into Jerusalem, and he tells the prophet Nathan that he wants to build a house for God, a temple for the Ark of the Covenant to reside in, a place of worship the people can come to, something more appropriate than the tent that the Ark had traveled in since the time of Moses. But then God turns the tables on David. Instead of David making God a house, God promises to David that he would build David a house. But God means something different. By house, God doesn't mean a physical home like David does. God explains what type of house he's planning on building for David. I will raise up your offspring after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, in part, this covenant with David is referring to David's son, Solomon. Solomon would go on to occupy the throne of Israel and to build a temple for God. But after the kingdom of Judah collapsed some 400 years later, the readers of the Old Testament realized this promise wasn't about Solomon. It was about God's Messiah, his anointed one. And in 2 Samuel 7, we learn he would be a descendant of King David. And somehow, his throne and his kingdom would last forever. So we get a foreshadow of God's Messiah, and after that promise, there's a brief description of the rest of David's peak of power. We learn about his many military victories over his enemies. We learn about his robust character, like when he discovers a grandson of Saul named Mephibosheth, and he raises him up to sit at his own kingly table, rather than to try to kill the descendants of his former enemy. All seems to be going well in Jerusalem. The king's on the throne. The promises to Abraham are fulfilled. The promise to David has been made. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in chapter 11, things take a turn. Here's where we don't like meeting our hero, David. The fall of David can be found in chapters 11 to 16, and our key verse shows up in 2 Samuel 12:13, where David simply says, "I have sinned against the Lord." Now, what happened? Well, we read that one day, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, all of David's generals are out to war while he's hanging out at home. He's walking the roof of his palace and admiring his kingdom when suddenly he notices a beautiful woman named Bathsheba, who's bathing on another roof. Despite learning that Bathsheba is the wife of one of David's mightiest and most respectable warriors, Uriah the Hittite, David immediately has her brought to his home, and he sleeps with her. And as though David's adultery weren't scandalous enough, things quickly get worse. Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and with Uriah being off at war, it's pretty clear the child isn't his. David becomes desperate to cover his tracks. He calls Uriah home to get him off the front lines and tries to convince him to go home to his wife, but Uriah's character is so pristine that he sleeps on David's floor rather than go home to Bathsheba. The contrast is painful. The mighty king of Israel is morally falling apart, while one of his warriors who he's betraying is honest. David's running out of options, so he pens a letter to his general named Joab. He sends this letter by Uriah's own hand, telling Joab to place Uriah at the likely location where he would be killed in the battle. To satisfy David's wishes, Joab is forced to pull off a particularly poor military strategy. Multiple men are killed alongside Uriah. And then, supposedly to comfort Uriah's widowed wife, David then marries Bathsheba, and shortly thereafter has a son. It seems like he's covered his tracks as long as you don't do the math. But the ending of chapter 11 is even more ominous than the beginning. The thing David had done displeased the Lord. He had his tracks from everyone else, but God had been paying attention. The man after God's own heart had gone after the desires of his own heart instead. Now, the prophet Nathan, you might remember him back from the covenant in 2 Samuel 7, he reappears here to talk to David about his sins. David is clearly held responsible for Uriah's murder, not to mention the other lost lives. He's held responsible for lying. He had just broken at least 4 out of the 10 commandments. But this devastating story also contains within it a remarkable moment of grace. Here's one of the first moments we see that sets King David apart from King Saul. It shows us why he was called a man after God's own heart, even when he fell so dramatically. In perhaps both the low and the high point of 2 Samuel, when David is confronted by Nathan with his sin, here's his response: "I've sinned against the Lord. No more, no less." Now, the writer of 2 Samuel, remember 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel are all one book, the writer wants us to contrast David's response with Saul's response back in 1 Samuel. Back in 1 Samuel 15, Saul had failed to carry out God's commandment of complete destruction of the Amalekites. He'd instead chosen to keep some of the best military spoil for himself. Similar to Nathan confronting David, Samuel confronts Saul with his sin. But unlike David, Saul makes a whole host of excuses. First, he claims he really did perform God's commandments. Then he blames the people for taking the spoil. And finally, when it's clear he can't get around it, he admits that he sinned. But in the very same breath, he says it really was the people's fault. Finally, in 1 Samuel 15, verse 30, we get a real glimpse into Saul's heart, when he says to Samuel, "I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel." When Saul was confronted with his sin, he confessed, but there was no change of heart. He'd failed God miserably, but he really clearly still wanted the honor and respect of the people. Now, contrast this with David's response: "I have sinned against the Lord. Nothing more and nothing less." David owns his sin. He admits it. And in response, the prophet Nathan says, "The Lord has put away your sin." And David is forgiven. Now, here's what epitomizes David as the man of God's own heart. On the one hand, David had sinned, and he'd sinned deeply, but he also repented deeply. He acknowledged his own sin. He didn't blame Joab or Bathsheba or anybody else like Saul would have. And that's what shows us what it means to be a man or a woman after God's own heart. It's not that you get it right all the time. It's not that you pass the tests with flying colors. It's that when you fall completely flat on your face, you admit your own sin and brokenness. You ask for forgiveness. And you seek again the heart of the God who loves you. However, despite David's forgiveness, his action does have tremendous consequences. You've probably seen how this happens in your life too. A friend might forgive you for saying harsh words, but the hurt is still there. The friend forgives you for crashing their car, but somebody still needs to buy a new car. In the same way, God's forgiven David, but the consequences of David's action reverberate over the ensuing chapters. Trauma and division begin to rack David's family. It starts in chapter 13. David's firstborn son, named Amnon, follows his father's poor moral example. He decides to sleep with his half-sister, Tamar, and then immediately mistreats and shuns her. Then, in a rage, Tamar's brother, Absalom, also uses his dad's problem-solving strategy by having his half-brother, Amnon, murdered. David's two sons, Absalom and Amnon, copied their own father's actions of illicit sexual activity and of murder to cover their own tracks. David is swallowed with grief and rage, and as a result, he refuses to see Absalom for years. So when Absalom finally returns to Jerusalem, he's so jaded by his rocky relationship with his dad that he starts a rebellion. Now, Absalom by nature was a handsome and inspiring man. He won an army of followers, and when they realize what's happening, David and his closest friends are forced to flee the city, and Absalom takes the throne. We've gone from the peak of David's power to his fall, and it's dramatic. But here is where the story takes a completely different turn than the rise and fall of Saul. The story's not over. There's one more act. David's fall from power is not the end of the story. The last section of Samuel, chapters 17 to 24, tell about the story of David's restoration. This is the key part that really brings the story of David together. And the key verse here is in chapter 23, verse 5. Here it is from the New Living Translation. Is it not my family, David's family, that God has chosen? Yes, he has made an everlasting covenant with me. His agreement is arranged and guaranteed in every detail. Despite David's great failures, God had made promises to David. And the language of covenant and promise is important because it shows us that this isn't a story about be a good guy like David or don't mess up like David. It's a story about how God's promises are unstoppable, even to people like David. So accordingly, these last 8 chapters are a bit of a mixed bag. They're full of ups and downs, successes and failures, much like our lives are, because it's the story of David trying again to live as the man after God's own heart, after his fall. The story of Absalom is one of these mixed bags. Absalom's rebellion turns out to be short-lived. In some ways, he seemed to have greater popularity than David, even gaining the power of his most respected military advisor, Ahithophel, but it's clear that God's promise remains on David. In chapter 17, we learn that the Lord ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. As a result, Absalom follows poor advice from a spy of David's named Hushai. Absalom goes into battle, and that ends up being his downfall. The Bible makes a great deal of Absalom's incredibly long and beautiful hair, his pride and joy, and it turns out, his Achilles heel. When he travels into battle, that long, luscious hair gets caught in the branches of a tree, and Absalom's mule just keeps on walking without him. Absalom is discovered, but unfortunately, he's discovered by David's bloodthirsty general Joab. Joab quickly murders Absalom, much to David's despair. David had been hoping for a reuniting with Absalom, but Joab has been characteristically violent throughout the book. It's one of the messy, mixed bag parts of 2 Samuel. He had murdered Abner, Saul's general. He murders Absalom, and before David can know of it, his son is killed. The revolt's defeated, and a saddened and broken-hearted David returns to Jerusalem. It's a strange mix. On the one hand, David's back as king, but the victorious warriors end up sneaking into the city because they're not sure if they should be glad they won the battle or sad because the king's son is dead. Now, the final few chapters of this historical narrative in 2 Samuel follow that kind of mixed bag pattern. There are stories of war and victory, rebellion, bloodthirsty violence, which is usually Joab's fault. There's prayer, there's famine, there's restoration, it all mingles together. And sometimes it's hard to tell if things are going well or if they're going poorly. And yet, in the mix and in the mess, 2 Samuel comes to a close in a remarkable way. Near the end of the book, David gives a beautiful song. It sort of encapsulates his life as he remembers God's deliverance and provision and restoration throughout his years. God rescued me. God brought me out. He drew me out of many waters. See, in this song, David makes many claims of God's gifts and God's love and God's grace, but there's one claim in particular that seems particularly bold. In chapter 22, he says, "The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, for I have kept the ways of the Lord. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt." Now, if you've listened to the rest of this, or if you've read 2 Samuel, you know that that's impossible for David to say. Anyone who just read the story knows David sinned many times by his own admission. His life was a mess. How could he claim to be blameless? Well, despite the mess, because of God's forgiveness of David, in God's eyes, it is as if David is blameless before God. That's how complete God's forgiveness is. Now, this great forgiveness is foreshadowed not just for David, but for us at the very end of the book. After a last accounting of David's many great deeds, he commits one last failure. He chooses to take a census of all of Israel. This doesn't seem like a big deal, perhaps, but the heart behind the census seems to be that David wanted to prove to himself his power and might, rather than trust in God's. After God pronounces punishment on David for his sin, there's a remarkable final episode that closes out the story. In a plea for God's forgiveness, David raises up an altar of sacrifice on the threshing floor of a man named Araunah, a Jebusite. And there, David offers a sacrifice to God to atone for his sin. Now, later on, David's son Solomon, the one back from 2 Samuel 7 who would build a house for God, well, Solomon would build that temple on this very site. It was such a symbol of God's forgiveness because the temple was where all sacrifices for sin would be offered. And many years later, on that same site, that temple curtain would be torn in two as the ultimate sacrifice for sin was offered for us, Jesus, on the cross. See, this final story in 2 Samuel 24 is really a foreshadowing for believers of what would happen 1,000 years later, as the ultimate covenant of 2 Samuel 7 was fulfilled. It turns out that David's descendant would not just ascend the earthly throne in Jerusalem, he would ascend a heavenly throne by the way of his death on the cross. And even though you and I might live as messy lives and as broken lives as David, the message is that through the forgiveness and love of Jesus, then like David, we can be considered as blameless as a shepherd boy, playing the harp and slinging a stone. We too can be heroes with feet of clay, not because of our own power, but because of the true hero of the story, the God of the Bible, who makes a way, even for people with feet of clay. At the beginning of 1 Kings, the next book in the Bible, David's life comes to an end. And in true David fashion, it's not in a particularly glorious way. He dispatches his son Solomon to do some of the dirty work of killing David's old enemies. And yet, despite not finishing so well, God's promises to David would still be fulfilled. His son Solomon would indeed build the house of the Lord, the temple in Jerusalem. And 1,000 years later, the full promises to David would be fulfilled through Jesus on the cross, just as God's promises to Abraham had been fulfilled 1,000 years after they were made. God's promises are fulfilled, and they were fulfilled beyond the wildest imagination.
Images for Heroes with Feet of Clay are provided by Kingstone Comics.
The best-selling book of all time. Now, the most complete graphic adaptation of all time. Action, adventure, romance, doctrine, history, the future. The Kingstone Bible. Own it today.
The Kingstone Bible and Kingstone Comics, available at the First Church Book Center or online at kingstone.co.